Welcome to Putting the Buyer Back into B2B with Buying Group Marketing webinar. I'm Nirosha Methananda. I'm the VP of Marketing at Influ2, and I'd like to welcome Malachi Threadgill. He's a Principal Analyst for Account-Based Marketing at Forrester. Thanks, Malachi, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Cool. What are we going to cover today? A little bit about buying group marketing. We've got a little bit to cover. Why we need to put the buyer back into B2B. Malachi is going to take us through that. Buying groups is a new organizing principle in B2B. A new generation of marketing metrics and success factors for buying group marketing. So to kick it off, let's talk a little bit about buying group marketing. So for those who work with me, or something to know about me is that I really enjoy PowerPoint, and I wanted to talk about account-based marketing in the context of my love of PowerPoint. I think PowerPoint gets a hard rep. I'd like to reach people in the product team at Microsoft that manage PowerPoint to let them know, I really enjoy PowerPoint. So from an account-based marketing perspective, you start with your list of target accounts. I know this circle looks like it's got chickenpox. It doesn't. These circles are supposed to represent accounts, large accounts, small accounts, medium accounts. So really, what I want to do if I want to reach, the product team at Microsoft for PowerPoint is look at Microsoft. And Microsoft worldwide has approximately 189,000 employees, and those figures are actually accurate. I got a reference from this year, but I don't want to reach all of them. I would like to reach people in the US. So 57% of those employees are in the US, which takes us to 108,000 people at Microsoft, and then Microsoft classifies 33% of its workforce as being in its product team. So I've taken that and accounted for that out of their US firm, and that takes me to about 35.6 thousand people. But dependent on your program and your data sources, this is really where your account-based marketing starts to focus. But I want to actually reach the people who are managing the PowerPoint. So I took an educated guesstimate that perhaps 5% of those people are focused on PowerPoint, and that takes me to around 1.7. 1,700 of the team at Microsoft that hopefully is working on PowerPoint, and I want to give a shout out to. And I just want to disclaim that is my total guesstimate around that. So the reason why I'm taking you through this example is because this is where buying group marketing focuses. It really does focus on those people within an account that you really do want to reach, and who are interested, in this case, hopefully in hearing from me, but in hearing from you. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So I know buying group marketing is a new term. It's another acronym that we can add to the marketing pile. But really what buying group marketing does, it serves to evolve the approach to ABM. And we're going to go through the what, how, and why. So the what, it's really about finding and engaging buying groups and decision makers inside your target accounts. And this is no different to what we're doing today. That's always the intention around it. But the how around it is really being mindful about monitoring the engagement signals and sentiment of your key decision makers and across these buying groups to be able to connect your sales and marketing activities with your teams with actionable insights, to be able to execute meaningful activity. And the why of this is it's to create a great customer experience, and to be able to address what your prospects or customers need to make their journey and their experience relevant to where they're at. So that at a high level is what buying group marketing is, as we've outlined it. And I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I know Malachi has got a lot of content to cover about this, but really it's essentially about working with sales to actively build interest and engagement throughout the funnel. I don't think this messaging is something that's groundbreaking. In fact, I think like it's very common right now throughout the B2B marketing ecosystem, with a lot of conversation about ABX and ABS as well. But what does that actually mean? So from a top of funnel perspective, it's, obviously around brand and demand, and you're having activity aimed at awareness at that account level. And then moving through, it's around engagement and education. So when the account is engaged, moving across channels to be able to educate the members of the buying group about what your offering is. And finally, and I do love alliteration, if you didn't know, convincing, conquering, and converting. So, when your sales team or when a key stakeholder is engaged, it's about being able to provide that air cover to really address the needs and concerns of those secondary buying group members and the influencers within that, to make sure that they're having that holistic experience. And as a group, they're coming together to come to that same decision around what your solution is. And the why of what you do this, why do this? It's really to be able to start tying that top of funnel through the funnel, rather than just playing at the top and then handing off to sales. To be able to collaborate with them, to be able and work with them, cohesively around engaging that buying group, and essentially creating that journey for your buyers around their persona, or their where they're positioned in that journey, so that they're receiving relevant information in a timely way. So that's a super high level outline of what buying group marketing is. And Malachi, you're going to take us through, why we actually need to put the buyer back into B2B.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so when we think about, what actually is occurring right now, and I think you said it absolutely well, it's an evolution on account-based marketing. And so why is this evolution occurring? We're going to be going through a few of the changes, but we'll be talking about data in a little bit. But that evolution was really driven by data. So we'll be talking about that in more detail shortly. But first and foremost, the changes in buyer behavior are driving the need for these buyer enablement strategies. So even before the pandemic, there was a massive change in what was going on in society, and how teams and organizations, leads and contacts were all consuming content. What happened with the pandemic is everyone went mostly digital or entirely digital. And that accelerated this change that we're seeing in terms of the buyer enablement strategies, and how we need to think about changing our reach, outreach, and everything else. Additionally, buyers' interactions with suppliers has increased by 59% between 2019 and 2021. And we'll be going into more detail about why that matters momentarily. But when you think about the interactions that organizations want to have around building trust, understanding the ecosystem, understanding the landscape, it really makes it important to figure out why this increase in action and activity is taking place. And part of that is the fact that the buying team continues to increase. 66% of B2B buying teams today comprise of more than 6 people. So when you start thinking about what's actually changing in the landscape and the committee that is being formed to make these decisions, we as sales and marketing need to come together to understand the needs and wants of those buying group members. So I alluded to the fact that we need to think about the leads and contacts not as leads and contacts, but as a cohesive unit of a buying group that's come together. We also need to partner more closely with sales and understand that marketing needs to be a support element, but sales also needs to be involved in the process sooner. And what we found with our latest research is that seller interactions do matter at every stage, from education, solution, and selection. The percentage of respondents that reported that they or someone from their organization received information from the sales rep, from the winning provider, this is a key nuance, to help them make the decision in that phase. So we start finding out that the winning provider providing that information early in the education phase is a critical factor for sales involvement in this process. So we've established that leads are not what's making the decision today. We'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. We've established that the buying process has changed partially because of the pandemic, partially because of data, and partially because of changing behaviors around the buying group. We've also established that sales needs to be involved in the process. There's another thing that's going on right now that is critical for organizations to understand, and that is that the ideas of demand and account-based marketing being separate ideas, separate teams, separate technologies, has crossed the tipping point. We are on a convergence path between these two ideas. And so when you think about how traditional demand teams are able to use data and analytics and intent and propensity to start moving broad demand more to the right, and you think about how one-to-one, one-to-few account-based marketing programs are now able to add scale, we've seen that for the first time ever, this convergence is on a definite path. And we actually believe at Forrester that by 2025, the concept or the idea of ABM as a separate entity within an organization will no longer be viable. And so when we think about this organizing principle of what the buying group and what the buyer means, we have to start looking at what is also going on. So we have our buyers, we understand their pains, needs, and wants. We understand that over 60% of the buying groups consist of 6 or more individuals. And we also look at the data that's coming out in terms of where organizations are focusing on their revenue growth. As the organizations move from CapEx to OpEx and the complexity of digital transformation continues, many organizations, it takes a lot longer. They need to understand the contracts, they need to understand everything that's going on. Additionally, organizations are trying to understand the life cycle of deploying these types of products. And can they choose a vendor that can solve their needs not just today, but in the future? And we believe that 77, the stat, only 30% of B2B marketers are using digital marketing channels to enrich that customer life cycle today. We believe that in 2022, marketing is going to be the year of the customer, in which the B2B organizations are really focusing on that existing customer base. As teams are understanding that depth and breadth of the relationship with vendors, the long-term value, Forrester suspects that short term, we see budgets going from 70% acquisition to 30% retention, upsell, cross sell, eventually to 50-50. And they're on their way to eventually 30% of marketing budgets being spent on net new acquisition and 70% being spent on that life cycle for upsell, cross sell, and retention. So we've said this a few times, buying groups are now the organizing principle. And so we're going to explain why, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail of what this means. So just to clarify, we have our markets, right? A market is multiple companies that are clustered around a common market segment, industry, geography, or enterprise. Within a market, we have an account, and this is where historically the account-based marketing concept and the PowerPoint example starts making a lot of sense. Within an account, we have multiple buying centers. And so for some organizations, especially smaller organizations, they may only have one product and they sell that one product into one type of account. It may be IT. But as organizations become more complex, I could have one product that could sell into IT or HR, or IT and HR and sales. And so when we start thinking about how we need to think about the collection of personas involved in that process or offering, it becomes incredibly tedious. And so when you start thinking about the nuance about who's actually involved in this, if we're spending all of our time, energy, and resources just on the account, we start having a lot of inefficiencies that are introduced in terms of marketing budget, sales time, BDR, RDR functions. And within the buying groups, we obviously have the personas. Sorry. So now let's set the stage and talk about this just a little bit more. So, and this statistic takes it down slightly to say that 81% of organizations with an annual ARR of over 5,000 consist of 4 or more buying groups. So when you think of 4 or more, and the first statistic around 6 or more, it becomes really prevalent. And so we have our champions, our ratifiers, our decision makers, and our influencers that are all part of this buying group. And the example that I love to share here is to say, let's think about it logically. Let's say our MCL to MQL score is 100, just to keep it simple. And any MQL that's over 100, we're going to pass over to sales, which a lot of current demand marketers do. The challenge there is we introduce things like second lead syndrome, buying group blindness, where we don't understand what's actually going on. If there are really 4 to 6 to 10 people that are involved in the buying process, would you rather have an opportunity that has one lead that has a score of 100, or would you rather have 4 contacts and maybe each of them have a score of 30? So the total buying group score would be 120, which is much higher than the one MCL or MQL that reaches 100. And so when we start thinking about that mindset, we can start shifting how we need to approach the buying groups in meaningful ways. And what this means is when we're deploying our programs, what starts to change, right? We have our individuals, the preferences, delivery channels, and content are determined by what the individual needs. The buying role is still pretty clear in terms of the ratifier, influencer, CXO, et cetera. When we start thinking about the buying group context, right now, a lot of organizations are really embracing the idea that these buying groups start to move as a group. Programs need to consider the needs of the entire buying group. We can't just create ad copy that's talking to the director of IT. We need to sell the user, we need to sell the CXO, et cetera. And what's interesting is that although the types of content may be different, we need to find a package for that buying group to be able to move together. Because if we don't have a container or package to understand what's actually going on with that buying group, we could have multiple opportunities being created. We could have one laggard that needs to catch up, et cetera. And so from an operational standpoint, making sure that we move that group together, even if we are able to consider that group and the content a little bit differently at the persona, is still incredibly important. So how do we do all of this? We introduced the first version of the Demand Waterfall by SiriusDecisions, which was acquired by Forrester in 2005. And I talk about this quite a bit. The first version of the Demand Waterfall was introduced the first version was introduced in 2005. Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in 2006 in January. So when you think about the idea that was introduced of an MCL, MQL, SQL, it's older than the iPhone. And so when we think about all the things, remove the pandemic, remove technology, remove data, propensity, machine learning, just all of the behaviors, digital transformation, all the behaviors that have occurred to make this massive change are incredibly prevalent. And over the years, we've evolved the waterfall. And we just introduced the latest iteration of what we now call the B2B revenue waterfall. And what this does is it really embraces the idea of our buying groups, not only around the buying group in terms of acquisition, but the renewal, upsell, and cross-sell. So when we take a look at how do we identify our target accounts, and within those accounts, how do we actually understand the opportunities that exist within those accounts? Going back to my example about different departments, different functions to make decisions at different times. How do we detect intent signals and prioritize our outreach? This would be our activation layer. And then how do we engage and qualify and start showing them the ads, the copy, the marketing, and our validate, and heading into our accelerate phase where we're working closely with sales. And so when we think about what we're trying to do, we establish what our program types are. At the top, we talk about, once again, acquisition, retention, upsell, cross-sell. But when we head into validate, we need to think about how we shift our mindset to capture attention, to increase engagement, whether it is net new or returning or upsell. And then as we head into acceleration, we can now use these insights to focus on the buying group to deliver value, show authority, handle any objections, and drive urgency, whether it is a new customer or a customer that's been a customer for 10 plus years.
Well, thank you, Malachi. So I think we're going to deep dive a little bit into a new generation of marketing metrics. So marketing is a little bit like my fetch that we were talking about before. I'm determined to make it work. And for context, marketing means sales and marketing together. I've also been heard it referred to as smarter marketing. So I think it can apply equally across.
This is possibly the most interesting and important piece of information that I can share from Forrester in this particular presentation. But our latest research is showing that in 2015, marketing sourced or MCL MQL pipeline was on 70% of CMO dashboards. By 2020, it was less than 50%. We suspect that by the end of 2023, fewer than 30% of CMOs are going to be focusing on marketing sourced in terms of the MCL and MQL as an indicator. And when you think about my diatribe before about all the changes in behavior and everything else, it becomes apparent and relevant that marketing needs to do more than just sourcing and acquiring that new logo. We need to be thinking about things differently. And the sample size that was brought into this was incredibly interesting, and the affirmation around the fact that it is so immediate that, if you think about the evolution from 8 years, that it'll be fewer than 30% is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we talked about, and also introducing something that Influ2 has introduced recently is its buying group engagement score, which essentially looks at across Influ2 campaigns what that activity at an account level looks like, but specifically within that buying group. So when you were talking about the MCLs to MQLs and that ratio of what you consider a priority, this buying group engagement score really starts to look at, okay, well, what is that engagement across that entire group in terms of who you're targeting through Influ2, and then how does that handoff work with sales to understand, what is their propensity to convert, or where are they at on that scale. So the diagram on the right hand side, the score goes from 0 to 80. It's considered engaged at 10 plus, and that may need to be adjusted based on audience and what your products and services are. But essentially, before that, it's again about driving that brand and demand and education, and then being able to really pass to sales, continue your air cover, and continue to drive that engagement score. As sales sort of goes through the process, to be able to really look at those granular campaigns. And I know this is something that we talked about before as well, with those buying groups, whether you keep them together or whether you split them out in terms of, each of their persona and where their position is. And I think it can end up being quite complex and quite nuanced in terms of understanding your audience, and I sort of wanted to delve into that a little bit, and also looking at a crystal ball of what metrics should sales and marketing focus on. We talked about this idea of the perpetual pilot, and this in the context of the sales cycle, and then the tenure of of a CMO. Can we delve a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's really interesting is that it is interesting, and not a lot of tools can actually do that. But when you think about the container, for instance, the opportunity object, right? If I have the opportunity object and it can be a container for the complete buying group, but I have a tool that can actually still deliver an individual person-based experience, and the buying group can still move together, it's incredibly powerful. And we're seeing things like the update to the OCR, where a contact can still have their own score, and the summation of the contacts can have a score on the opportunity. So hypothetically, you could still treat them differently based on that intent, but it's incredibly important to make sure that group is still, they need to be on the same bus. They could all be watching a different movie, but making sure they're sticking together is critical. In terms of the perpetual pilots, this is something that I think is really important. And I think a lot of ABM programs that are stuck, and we have a lot of conversations around ABM pilots, because oftentimes organizations will come to Forrester because they were promised a panacea and they didn't get it, and they had a failed pilot with an ABM platform. They tried another ABM platform, it didn't work. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the mindset around this is that oftentimes ABM programs really focus on the trailing indicators, revenue, and revenue is obviously important. Revenue drives businesses. I suspect the majority of the people watching this right now work for-profit companies, and so when you think about how do you drive revenue, that's incredibly important. But when you think about, if you take an example, as a practitioner, our average contract. So if you take this example, the average tenure of a CMO and high tech, the average contract length is 3 years, and the common stated sales cycle is 12 to 18 months. And so if the tenure of the CMO is nearly as long as the sales cycle and it's a 3-year contract, most ABM pilots, by the time they actually get them off the ground and launch them, the CMO's gone. And so now the next person comes in and resets and starts a pilot. The issue is, though, that with this data that we have today, with these programs that we have today, we can start thinking about things differently. So, as a practitioner, I was lucky. I had a demand ABM, marketing operations in the BDR function. It was awesome. But what was really cool about that was that we took a really data-driven approach. And I was able to say, okay, if I have high quality accounts, high fit accounts, they're showing 3 or more buying signals, and I put them in a campaign, for instance, have my BDR do outreach to them. I'm showing them the very, very targeted display ads. The connection rate of the BDR team went from 1% to 4%. So if
Mhm.
you think about the down funnel implications, if I'm having 4 conversations with the right person who has a business need that I can help, and I'm creating edification and helping them where they're seeing content about us, of course they're going to be more responsive. And so when we think about those leading indicators, we can start thinking about different things that we can start to do. We can set up control groups where, commonly some of the complaints that and I don't want to dig at sales because sales is great, but we run these display campaigns and we want to know how many form fills we got. Well, a lot of the purpose of them isn't that. So we can create a control group to say, if I have a tier 1 account and opportunities on both, let's make sure we don't show 20% of them ads, and 80% we do show ads. So now we can test how our journey lifecycle marketing is really impacting positively. And we've seen examples where the win rate jumps as much as 60% for organizations that are receiving that lifecycle focus throughout that buyer's journey. And it
Right.
becomes self-evident because if you think about it, and it's down to an RFP and it's the final 2 companies, and you're showing ads, you're engaged, sales is engaged, and your competitor's not showing any ads, there's that affirmation index or affirmational piece that's always top of mind.
Right, right. And so I think, like, what we talked about, it really is a little bit of setting yourself up for success in that sense, with the test rather than, going whole hog with an entire program. That's one thing. And then, but also education around, like, and working with sales to be able to, to have that synchronous relationship with that account. I think is the key takeaways from that.
Absolutely.
Cool. And then, we've already sort of touched on this around the over indexing on MQLs and looking at alternate signals. I think this is quite interesting because it was around the ratio of, what you consider like a strong signal from an MQL perspective, but then also augmenting it with things like your closed won, closed lost, and then intent as well. Is there, what should we be, or what should marketers start considering when they're augmenting, for those alternate signals, and how, like, I guess, what should we look at from a structure perspective?
Yeah, and for there's nothing wrong with an MQL, but a lot of times it's the data that matters where. And when we think about a hierarchy of, you could have leads that are scoring 100 and getting MQL'd, but then if you take a look at the account, they're an account that would never buy from you. They're a competitor doing research, and these are common things that people think about. And so the Goldilocks zone are really focusing on, okay, can we focus on right accounts that have that are a good fit, they're more likely to buy from us. We know they're in market. We can start focusing on that. And oftentimes, this is where the trust element with sales becomes critical because, and this is a big misalignment thing. If marketing is judged on MQLs alone, marketing can say, okay, I created 40,000 MQLs. I did my job. Sales, you're not closing anything. And then sales comes back and says, well, the leads were crap. And then we get into the common sales versus marketing focus. And so it really is building that trust and focusing on the quality of the the hierarchy right above that. So once again, if you have a high quality, and this is why all three matter, right? So if we have a high quality account that's not showing any buying signals, or opportunity that's not showing any buying signals, someone fills out a form, you may be talking to them at the wrong time. They may not be in market. They may be doing research, and you can decide what to do with that. But if you
Mm.
create an opportunity and now sales is sitting on pipeline for 3 years until they're ready, that's not good either. That's not efficient. Simultaneously, if you have a bad account that's never going to buy from you, it's showing a lot of intent, and someone fills out a form, there are a lot of instances where we talk to people that it's too expensive from a customer service aspect, or they always buy on price. These are all things that we need to think about, and that's why combining the account-based perspective with buying groups becomes the organizing factor for what we need to be doing.
Right, right. And where, I guess, one of the things that, and obviously from my previous experience as well, intent is something that has and is being more and more prevalent within marketing programs and as a signal. What's your, I get, we had an interesting conversation around different types of intent and looking at and understanding that it'd be good if we could deep dive into that a little bit as a signal to be able to include, because I think that's certainly a question that a lot of people have when they're looking at their broader marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a challenge, is that everyone says they have intent, and like the intent signals could mean very, very, very different things. So if you're buying, first off, you have first party intent. Are they coming to my website? Can I identify either their IP address or the person? People often don't realize that their closed loss data is often just as good. If I know that it's a 3-year sales cycle, it's a good fit account, and we lost it 2 years ago, or 3-year contract, we lost it 2 years ago. Well, hey, maybe we should refresh that and go after it. But then you start thinking about, everyone says, oh, it's intent, and a lot of people say, their intent's the best intent, and only use their intent. But intent means so many different things, and it's hard to. And we at Forrester call them buying signals, because the buying signals can be very wildly different. So a content syndication signal, where someone goes to that website, has to fill out the form to read an article. It may
Mhm.
be very, very specific and a high tech example. It may be a foot wide but a mile deep, where some of the other intent aggregators may be a mile wide, covering every single topic that's available, but they only say high, medium, or low.
Mhm.
And then you may have a review website that is, really accurate at saying, if someone's looking at Acme versus Beta, they're looking for this solution category. Well,
Right.
oftentimes, if they're at the stage where they're comparing Acme versus Beta, and you're not Acme or Beta, you're out of the RFP. You're not going to be coming back in. And so that's not to diminish any of those signal types. They're all incredibly important, but how organizations understand that and how they triangulate them becomes critical. And they honestly become additive. If people can have access to them and add them together in some way, it
Mm.
really starts moving the needle, and the odds that they're in market starts jumping dramatically.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. No, I think that is, you've hit the nail on the head in being able to triangulate how you actually use them, in congruence, like, or orchestrate them so that it's right for what your product is, what your service is, and what your audience, who your audience is as well, in terms of consumption. And I know we've sort of touched on the final point or the last ball, around the normalization and efficiency around who's in market. And really, I think the crux of what this is, from what you were talking about, is like, who is actually in market? Because there's always this expectation that all of your accounts are always in market at all the time. And that's just not true.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the challenges that oftentimes people want to combine propensity to buy with intent signals. And you can have a very high propensity account that's not in market, and you can also have very highly active accounts that aren't high propensity. And the example I like to use is going back to that 3-year contract. Is if we put all of the accounts and normalize all of our data over a long period, and we're sales and marketing are just picking accounts out of a hat, which is what we see often, we're going to be wrong 66% of the time. And so this random act of marketing means that we have inefficient marketing budgets because we're advertising to the wrong people, wrong timing, inefficient sales usage of time. Going back to that 1% versus 4% for an RDR team, well, it's just as much timing as it is understanding that. And so, if we go back to the buying signals, the goal of adding buying signals using this data and understanding and combining it together, it's not to get to 100% accuracy, but if we can get from one intent signal, let's say it's 50% accurate, just picking a number out of the air. Well, if we go from 33% to 50%, that's a 16 percent improvement. Now it sounds bad because it's a coin flip, but it's still better than you'd be doing before. If we had a second or third, how much higher does it go? And I think those are important things that people need to be considering.
Definitely. Cool. Well, I think we're going to move on in terms of, and look at some of the success factors around buying group meeting. I don't know how I missed that one. It should be buying group marketing. So, but success factors for buying group marketing. And Malachi, I think you're going to talk to us about data.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've alluded to a lot of this before, but organizations are increasing their spend on data. 47% of organizations planned to increase their spend this year, and we're working on the preliminary numbers for next year. But when you just look at the market trends, and organizations are just ingesting more and more data, and the commoditization of data is really what's making it accessible. And when you think about the changing behavior, 5 years ago, running propensity models was incredibly expensive, but the massive evolution of machine learning, AI, et cetera, as well as the volumes of data that we all create as human beings, all being packaged together, means that B2B is really catching up in terms of their ability to collect data and draw insights from that data. So when you think about not just buying more data, but are they going to increase the number of data providers? If you look at 1 to 9 and 10% or more, 47% of organizations plan on adding additional data providers to their pool. So more data providers is what we're saying is the trends moving forward.
I agree with you. I think data is something that is foundational, and so we've sort of gone through and like how to think about what are the fundamentals from a buying group, to help with buying group marketing execution. Split them into sort of 3 buckets around strategy, experience, and marketing. So obviously, this is something that we've discussed throughout the webinar in terms of that connection between account-based marketing and buying group marketing is super important. You need to know who you're going after. You need to know who your ICP is and what your prioritization criteria is, and have that strategy in place. So you're not sort of trying to find a needle in a haystack, so to speak, or to reduce that haystack. The other thing is having a really solid understanding of the architecture of who is in your buying group is going to be critical to be able to execute, and having a clear understanding about who they are, what their personas are, what their needs are, and what role they play as well. And this sort of leads into the experience bucket or experience category, because really, if you're clear about that, then you can produce content that is related to their pain point, and that's relevant to what their role is, essentially. And the other thing is really looking at a diversity of your creative, both from a visual perspective, but also diversity in terms of the channels of where they play. Not everyone looks at their emails. Not everyone looks at ads. There are so many diverse channels, so it's getting a really good understanding from that strategy of, okay, where do they play? What's important to them, and where am I able to get their attention? And part of that comes into mapping and planning for the orchestration of their journey, of how that's going, so that you're not sort of saturating through that, and making sure it's an optimal experience. And finally, marketing, which we established with sales and marketing, um, is critical to this. It's critical to be able to have agreement around the prospect journey stages, and what the accountability and the responsibility is. So having shared metrics between the two teams is essential. Between, I think you referred to that that battle between sales and marketing, where it's like, well, I gave you all the leads, and then nothing converts, and the leads are crap. Like that is that I've heard that too many times, and I think that's something that definitely has to evolve, and I think is evolving. Um, and I think the way to be able to do that around that is really having an understanding and the mapping of these accounts between the teams, and how you're going to work together, and having an understanding of what the communication is going to be like, what the handoff is going to be like. I think some of those soft skills, or get a little bit dismissed in part of this process, and it's really important to be able to establish them. They're almost as important as putting a number or a percentage to it. So that's sort of where, like, the three sort of buckets around buying group marketing execution. And I guess sort of finally, it's this strategy is really dependent on an organization being laser focused and really having precision around their execution. It's not a sort of spray and pray approach at all. It's about being very careful and meaningful in your actions. So that's sort of what that's sort of where we conclude. I don't know if, Malachi, you have anything to add to that?
No, I completely agree, and I do think that omni-channel becomes a critical factor, and I also think that, yeah, the we oftentimes forget that the message, the way a message is delivered, is just as important as the message itself, and
Yeah.
so understanding that nuance is critically important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Feel free to reach out to Malachi or myself. Our contact details are there. I think we'll close there then.
Thank you so much.